Did you think laser engraving would be easy? I did, and over the last 3 years, I've somehow managed to build over 800 laser projects, but honestly, it was a grind with a really slow start, and I wish I'd known how to do it smarter. So to help you make your laser engraving journey 10 times easier, here are 15 pivotal lessons that I've learned to help you fast forward to making laser projects that you're proud of. First lesson takes me back to when I got my first laser. The learning curve really hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought it was going to be as simple as loading up a few files and pressing on start. And that's literally how early laser companies like Glowforge advertised these things. They called them laser printers or 3D laser printers, but I quickly realized that lasers definitely don't work like the standard paper printers that most people are used to. And what I learned is that lasers are actually a lot more like a scroll saw or a chisel, which require much more skill and understanding to make good projects. And once my expectations were reset, I was able to start making progress, and I began to understand what I needed to do with the laser in order to get projects like this. So lesson number 1 is that lasers aren't printers. Expect to learn them like a good old-fashioned tool. Now, of course, it does take longer to learn laser engraving than to press start on a printer, but in the long run, I think we're actually better off this way, because as you learn more about your laser, you'll unlock cooler and cooler projects, which does not happen with a standard paper printer. Lesson number 2, the very first cut project I ever did quite literally filled my house up with smoke. I tried to fix it with a series of small upgrades until I finally got the system that I have today, which keeps my shop's air squeaky clean. I only wish I had made bigger improvements earlier to protect my health and to keep my shop from stinking. So lesson number 2 is to go overkill on your exhaust system from day one. You almost definitely need a more powerful exhaust system than you think, especially if you'll be doing a lot of laser cutting, which produces more fumes. And depending on if you buy a budget or a premium laser, there's also a very good chance that the exhaust system that comes with your laser is not as effective as advertised. So many beginners will need to upgrade, and if I were starting over, I'd want somebody to tell me to go big on the exhaust from the beginning. And by the way, comment below if you want a deeper video on my current setup and what I've learned about laser exhaust over the last 3 years. Lesson number 3. So last year I got this white laser back here in the corner, but I couldn't get it to give me the completely clean cuts on the fairly detailed K-12 picture frames that I make, and ultimately I figured out that the built-in air assist was simply not good enough. So I did something that I wouldn't recommend for safety reasons, and that is to modify the laser to bypass the internal air assist pump with a feed for my own external air compressor. This fixed the issue, proving that the air assist was the underlying problem, and that brings me to lesson number 3, which is to only buy lasers with an external air assist pump input. And if you're thinking that that was only necessary because this is a budget desktop CO2 laser with a crappy pump, not so fast, because even the internal pump on my very expensive Aeon Mira 9 red line behind me isn't powerful enough to give me the perfectly clean cuts that I want. But the difference, and the reason that I still bought this Aeon that's behind me, is that that laser does have an input port for an external air compressor, which completely solves the issue because it allows me to use my external air compressor, which is much more powerful and can get me to the 15 to 20 plus PSI I typically use to get scorch-free cuts like this example, which was not sanded or masked at all. So this is why I would only recommend buying lasers that do accept an external air assist, and I would completely avoid all of the closed system lasers that only allow you to use their built-in air pumps. Lesson number 4, I overpaid for my first laser because I got the highest wattage available for the model I wanted, which at the time was a 20 watt diode laser head. Times have changed. I later got a new laser with just 10 watts and actually loved it because a lower wattage usually also means a smaller spot size, which means the laser itself is more precise for things like photo engraving. And so for people who are buying their first laser, I actually think it's a great idea to save some cash and get a lower wattage, especially if you're not sure what projects you want to do yet. So lesson number 4 is don't overpay for watts you don't need, and if you get sucked into laser engraving like many of us do, you'll probably eventually have multiple lasers in your shop anyway. So save some money up front, and if you want to, you can always do the big upgrade to a mega wattage machine down the road. Lesson number 5. Speaking of saving some money, my very first laser was in fact a cheap diode laser engraver, and looking back, I still think that this is the best type of laser for most beginners to start with. And when I decided to do my first big upgrade into pricier lasers, I got an X-Tool P2, which in today's market is pretty similar to other budget CO2 lasers in the $2,000 to $3,000 price range. But after months of use, I found a bunch of problems with this class of laser. For example, because of the controller used in these budget CO2 lasers, they are basically incapable of making perfectly scorch-free corners on line engravings like this. While on a premium CO2 laser with a nicer controller called a DSP controller, this problem is completely solvable by adjusting the minimum power setting in LightBurn, a step that cannot be done on a budget CO2 laser without a DSP controller. But not only that, due to the smaller spot size and wattage, you can also get rid of that issue on a diode laser. So it's only on the budget CO2 lasers in this mid-tier price range that makes this problem basically impossible to solve, unless of course you run the project on a different laser. And to be honest, this is just one of several gripes I have with the entire class of budget CO2 lasers specifically, which is why if my cousin or brother asked me what laser to buy, I would tell them to buy an enclosed diode laser for $500 to $1,500, or to go big and buy a premium CO2 laser with a DSP controller, which will start anywhere from $4,000 to $7,000 at the time of recording. So lesson number 5 is to buy cheap lasers, or to go big and completely skip the mid-range CO2 lasers. This is probably one of my spicier or potentially more controversial takes, but this is exactly what I would tell a friend if they asked me in person, so do with it what you will. Lesson number 6, in the early days, I didn't understand how material test grids worked. I saw downloads online marketed as universal test grids, thinking it would be as simple as downloading a file and running the test with the press of a button. It turns out it's not that easy, because it's technically impossible for a single test grid to be universal across all lasers. So I went into research mode until I finally understood how test grids actually work, and today I consider this to be the #1 most useful laser skill I have learned, and it's unlocked everything from simple projects like this to advanced grayscale photo engraving like that. So lesson number 6 is to learn how test grids really work, and every new project will get easier. And if this is something that you've had trouble wrapping your head around, then I've got something that'll help. You can get my free LightBurn starter kit by joining my email newsletter, and this comes with 5 free test grid templates and a video that walks through what each of the tests are for and how you can adjust them to fit your specific laser. I'll link to that in the description below for anybody who wants to get it. Lesson number 7. A couple of years back, I was trying to learn how to do an engraving like this on glass using my diode laser, where you get these nice white frosted looking engravings, and I wound up watching a bunch of YouTube videos of people showing the process on CO2 lasers. And this was a problem because CO2 lasers interact differently with glass compared to the diode laser that I had. And if this is your first time hearing that, basically a CO2 laser can engrave directly on glass, whereas a diode laser can't. And so in order to get engravings like this, you actually have to paint the glass for engraving with a diode laser. For example, the best results I've gotten has come using Prang brand black tempera paint like this. But I didn't know any of that at the beginning, and so I wasted a bunch of time watching videos that were completely irrelevant to my situation before I finally figured it out. So lesson number 7 is when you watch a tutorial, check what type of laser it's for before you watch the whole thing. It'll save you a lot of time that you might have spent going down a dead end, and it's also why I've been trying to mention whether or not a video is for a diode or CO2 laser in the intro of my more recent YouTube videos. Lesson number 8, the one laser topic that took me the longest to figure out in the early days was positioning or alignment. In other words, how to place the materials in the physical workspace such that my engravings would go exactly where I wanted. I spent an embarrassingly long time trying to figure this out, and I think part of the reason why is I kind of bounced around without taking enough time up front to fully understand how it worked. But eventually, through research and trial and error, everything clicked, and today alignment comes easy even on lasers without a camera. So lesson number 8 is to spend extra time up front learning positioning and coordinates. It's easy once it clicks. And if you ask me, this is also one of the biggest things that will help you get comfortable with your laser, because understanding how it moves will make it feel a lot more like a regular tool and less like a magical mystery box. Lesson number 9, when we first started making these K-12 picture frames that I've talked about a few times, we were only using diode lasers. And that was a problem because diode lasers can't cut clear acrylic. And these frames required a piece of clear plastic, kind of like this, to go on the inside of the 2 panels. And so I came up with an analog solution, which I still use today, which is to cut them to size with a big paper cutter, and then to just drill holes in the corners for the screws with a basic drill. So lesson number 9 is just because you have a laser doesn't mean you should use it for everything. And now that I have CO2 lasers in my shop, I definitely could do this step by taking a sheet of clear acrylic and cutting it to size, and even doing the little corner screw holes on the panel using a CO2 laser. But have you ever heard that saying, when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail? Well, I think that applies to us laser people, and so I think it's just a good reminder that using multiple tools on a laser project is in fact allowed. Lesson number 10. Just this week, I've been working on a fairly tricky new project for my mom, and my mom is like the world's biggest fan of canoeing. And so my brother and sister and I want to get her a nice new canoe paddle, and then to engrave the initials of the whole family down the length length of the handle. And I was even thinking about doing it in each person's handwriting by using the trace feature in LightBurn. But the hard part of this project, and the one that I'm pretty sure I've just figured out, is finding a top tier canoe paddle that's unfinished so that I can engrave it and then finish it myself. So lesson number 10 is that sometimes finding the right blanks or materials is actually more important than the engraving itself. It took a little patience, but after some research and 2 phone calls, I've worked out the details with a Wisconsin-based paddle company who actually makes canoe paddles that are sold in REI. And by contacting them and ordering from them directly, I was able to put in a special request for a completely unfinished canoe paddle, and they also offered to leave off all of the normal logo stamps that they normally put on their paddles, which is great because that gives me more surface area that I can engrave. And by the way, the company I'm talking about is called Bending Branches. I have no affiliation with them or anything like that, but they seem super cool and they were really helpful to me. And so if you're looking to get a top-of-the-line canoe paddle to engrave, now you at least know one place you can look. Lesson number 11. When I was still pretty new to LightBurn, I got kind of intimidated by the other non-LightBurn software people were using to create their laser projects. For example, a lot of people use advanced design software like Adobe Illustrator, which is expensive and has a learning curve of its own. But as I learned more about LightBurn, I was pretty happy to see that you can do pretty much anything you need directly in LightBurn. And yes, I'm sure there are special features and other benefits of those other software tools, but if you're a beginner, I think it's really encouraging to know that you don't need to learn all those other tools. And so lesson number 11 is that LightBurn is the only software you need. Everything else is completely optional. And by the way, if you want to jumpstart your progress with LightBurn, then just a reminder, you can get my free LightBurn starter kit on my email newsletter, which is linked in the description below for anybody who's interested. Lesson number 12. The first place I ever went to learn about LightBurn was YouTube. I learned a ton from those videos, especially from the Louisiana hobby guy who has been making really helpful LightBurn videos for longer than anyone. But the problem I started to run into was that sometimes I would have a super specific question about the software, and I might spend an hour or even longer trying to find an answer in various YouTube videos. But then I learned from a Louisiana hobby guy video actually that I could find LightBurn's documentation for basically every option within the software with the press of a button. So lesson number 12 is don't be afraid of LightBurn's documentation. It's actually really easy to use. So for example, let's say you're here in LightBurn and you're trying to learn more about some of these buttons over here on the left-hand side. And let's specifically say that you're trying to figure out what this little ruler icon does. What you can do on a PC is you can just hover over that little ruler icon and then click the F1 key on your keyboard. Or if you're on a Mac like me, you can hold on the Fin or function key and then click F1. And what it's going to do is it's going to open the LightBurn documentation page. You can see I'm right here on the LightBurn software website, and it's opened us directly to the measure tool, which is the name of that ruler icon that we were just looking at in LightBurn. And it basically walks you through what this tool does, how you can use it, and it has a bunch of examples, even with little animations that sort of show the use of it. And some of them even have a video at the top, as you can see here. And so this is really useful, especially for things that are super specific and sometimes harder to find on YouTube. Lesson number 13. I used to get stressed that I didn't know how much we were spending on electricity to run a laser project, thinking that a laser must be using huge amounts of energy. But then I did a bit of math and learned that even a multi-layer cut project like our K-12 picture frames run on my 60-watt CO2 laser only costs about a penny to run. However, there are other costs that I didn't think about as much that are much more likely to impact the bottom line. For example, I recently dropped and had to replace my lens, and I also replaced a couple of mirrors, and those things aren't particularly cheap. So lesson number 13 is don't stress about electricity costs, but budget for things like lens and mirror replacements, particularly on CO2 lasers. You probably won't spend as much on a diode, but you get the idea. So anyway, if that's something that you've worried about in the past, hopefully that will put things into a bit of perspective for you and relieve some of that stress. For lesson number 14, I've got another show and tell project over here, and this is probably my single favorite laser product that my wife and I have ever made. I love dinosaurs, what could I say? But despite us personally liking it, this was our single biggest laser product flop because we made one critical mistake, and that was that we launched a product without a market. In other words, we created something that nobody was actually looking for. And that's why we haven't sold a single one of these to this day. And so lesson number 14 is if you want to sell, create original projects in an already popular category. For example, we have sold over 270 of our pet memorial garden stake product, which is in the already popular category of pet memorials, but it's still unique and different than the other options within the overall category. Lesson number 15. The first 5 laser projects I ever made were using pre-made laser files I bought off of Etsy. I made them for gifts, but quickly learned 3 things. Number one, these files are not as plug and play as you'd think. You still have to understand LightBurn and what settings to use. Number two, when you make these types of projects, it just feels less satisfying than creating something of your own, which is something I learned later on. And number three, if you want to sell, it's a lot harder to stand out if you're using the same design 500 other people also downloaded. So lesson number 15 is to stop using laser files. Creating your own is better. And to be clear, I'm not saying you have to start completely from scratch on every new project. You can also create designs by combining your own work with pre-made artwork, assuming you have the appropriate permissions, of course. The key is that you're the one making the creative decisions to create something new. And if you ask me, this makes more thoughtful gifts, it makes products that stand out, and it'll be more fun in the long run. But of course, that doesn't actually tell you how to create your own original laser projects from scratch, so click on this video here on screen to learn more about that process. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye now.